inquiry subject will be dirigible airships, and an idea whose time has come. And for the affirmative, we have Frank D. Winston. For the negative, representing Santa Clara, is Dean Gerald Uelmen from Santa Clara University School of Law. And his able assistant, Willys Peck. And our distinguished panel of judges is Honorable Mark Thomas in the center from Santa Clara County. Honorable George Choppelas from San Francisco Municipal Court. And to fill out the third is Lieutenant Gregory Bridges from Moffett Field. We'd also like to thank Lieutenant Bridges for the use of this facility, and also we'd like to thank Moffett Field. And following this Court of Historical Inquiry, there will be a tour of Hangar 1, the large dirigible airship hangar behind us. Thank you very much.
Okay, you may proceed.
Ready to proceed, Your Honor.
Ready to proceed? All right. How would you like us to proceed?
I think the party having the affirmative should be proceed, so.
I use the podium not because I need it, because I brought one out. I figured, what's it doing here unless we can address it? Because the witnesses over there. Over there, you will hear some testimony today that might seem shocking, but really is part of the whole American principle. Why are we here? Moffett Field. Why are we here adjacent with NASA? Because these are homes of pioneers. California, home of pioneers. The issue today is whether or not we should reconstitute our faith in dirigibles amongst other types of transportation. The good Dean Uelmen, which is possibly the only time I'll refer to him as the good, will probably suggest to you that it's something that tried and failed. Well, if that were the test, then none of us should be here because many things have been tried and failed to resurrect it. But what we must understand is at the time of the initial experiments while we were pioneers, political and other reasons, we got shut off. Maybe the finest of technology had not yet arrived, but clearly today it has. So those of you who want to go out of this room, and those judges who feel comfortable in deciding how this should be in 1910, go right ahead. But we're in the 1990s. We should look at what we had, what we have, and what we could have. My witnesses will establish without any hesitation and beyond any doubt that what we should have today is the use of the dirigible, and the use for economy, the use for society, for the few amongst you who must take the Concorde and must get to Phoenix tomorrow in 20 seconds. All right. We can't quite accomplish that with our vessel. For those of you who recall the grace of flying, the luxury of the Orient Express, the comfort of the skunk train in California, then there is a reason to be here. There is a reason to advocate the restoration and the admiration of the dirigible. We're ready to call our witness, but I understand protocol allows whatever his name is to say something for the record. And so whichever way you want to do it, but Jerry, I believe you're on now.
Today's trial is about technology. But today's trial is also a trial about romance. And I'm going to concede right at the outset that Mr. Winston has romance on his side. This may be the only case he's ever tried where he has romance on his side. Lighter than air, flight has always had romance in its favor. But heavier than air flight has consistently had technology in its favor. Today we are revisiting a dispute that raged for 40 years, from the first faltering steps into the air at Kitty Hawk right up until the outbreak of World War II. There was a fight going on between the primacy of lighter-than-air craft and heavier-than-air craft. To some extent, it was a fight over the defense budget, very similar to the kind of fights over the defense budget that we've seen in our own time. One rigid Zeppelin cost $5 million in 1930 dollars. 1930 dollars were worth a lot more than today's dollars. And for that cost, the Navy could have 50 flying boats, or an entire aircraft carrier. And that is the battleground on which, to a great extent, this battle was fought and won by heavier-than-air craft. Each year, airplanes flew higher, they flew further, and they flew faster. But the lighter-than-air ships had only one way to go. They grew larger. And as they grew larger, they grew more unwieldy and more unmanageable. And a succession of air disasters, of airship disasters that we will hear about, finally convinced us that the hour for these airships had passed. And that was actually proved to us long before the disaster of the Hindenburg. Many of us have imprinted on our minds the disaster of the Hindenburg as the final Valhalla of the airship, the greatest airship disaster in history. It was not. In terms of the loss of human life, the Hindenburg was the 5th greatest disaster of airships in history. The greatest disaster was the loss of the Akron in an Atlantic storm in April of 1933. Actually, only 1 month before the Akron went down, her sister ship, the Macon, had been christened. And the Macon is a ship that was stationed right here at Moffett Field. And I hope none of you will leave without stopping as you go out and visiting the Macon room, where there are some wonderful artifacts of when the Macon was stationed here at Moffett Field. The Macon was actually christened as an airship by the wife of Admiral William A. Moffett. Admiral Moffett was the chief of the Naval Bureau of Aeronautics and a tireless promoter of lighter-than-air ships for the Navy. Admiral Moffett was among the 73 victims who died in the crash of the Akron. And very shortly after that crash, this facility was named in his honor as Moffett Field. Our chief witness in these proceedings is going to be one of the 3 survivors of the Akron disaster, U.S. Navy bosun mate Richard Deal. Bosun mate Deal was known to his Navy buddies as Lucky Deal, and with good reason. Lucky Deal survived 10 years of service in the United States Navy, flying on lighter-than-air airships. And he is going to give us a first-hand account of the triumphs and the tragedies of those airships. And we even have brought along a filmed account of some of the events that he is going to describe. At the outset of this trial, I think it will be helpful for everyone if we defined a few terms, because you're going to hear a lot of words thrown around here about lighter-than-air ships, and I think we should define our terms right at the beginning. When we talk about lighter-than-air craft, we're talking about aircraft that achieve their lift by displacing air with a gas that is lighter than air. At the beginning, hydrogen was used for that purpose. Because of its highly explosive nature, hydrogen was replaced by helium, which is not flammable. But helium doesn't have quite the lifting power of hydrogen. It has about 92% of the lifting power of hydrogen. Now, the reality of lighter than air use of helium is that it takes 45 cubic feet of helium to lift 1 pound. That means it takes 90,000 cubic feet of helium to lift a ton. And the large airships, the Akron, the Macon, the Hindenburg, actually had between 8 and 9 million cubic tons of helium to achieve the lift that they needed to become airborne. The term dirigible refers to all lighter-than-air craft that are engine-driven and steerable. So the term dirigible includes both the Zeppelins and the blimps. The Zeppelins were rigid aircraft with a rigid framework filled with the balloons that contained the gas. The blimps had no internal support. They were kept in shape simply by the internal pressure of the gas. To contrast with the dirigibles is the balloon, which is simply a gas bag that cannot be steered, that goes whichever way the wind blows, kind of like Frank Winston. We will demonstrate in the course of this trial that the hour of the dirigible airship has come and gone. As a means of passenger transportation or as a military weapon system, the airship has a romantic past, but no future. Thank you.
Before calling our first witness, we have a procedural matter to address. As many of you familiar with trials recognize, lawyers will sometimes move the court to strike certain types of testimony. I was very indulgent when Dean tried to get in the poisoning of the court with some alleged tragedies. And there will be a sympathy vote for a gentleman who has survived a fall. But I would ask this court right here and now, even though I was generous enough not to interrupt his opening statement, to strike any reference to any tragedy or any sad event that has occurred or might have occurred with reference to this issue. Because, as you know, if we were to have a trial dealing with a crime, the introduction of a grotesque picture would be barred by the court if that picture might be prejudicial to the outcome of the decision. And hence I think if you're going to decide between romance and technology, you ought to do so on the basis of what we have, not what you want to inflame, if you'll excuse the pun, inflame this jury with. So we would ask you right now to make a ruling that the witness may testify, but not at all about any tragedy is witnessed, and any chart that supposedly has a number of people who may have perished shall not be allowed to poison this panel. We would move the court to rule at this time that you cannot hear that kind of testimony.
Can we confer on this gentleman, or shall I? You'd rule without us?
This is a kangaroo court.
Right. We're above the also.
We feel we're above being inflamed, so well,
There was also a reference that I must correct before calling upon our witness. Jay, as he is sometimes called amongst his friends, made reference to Winston and the wind that blows. So let me give it to you in the total context of Winston's philosophy that permeates this scene. Whatever way the wind doth blow, some heart is glad to find it so. So blow it east or blow it west. The way it blows, that way is best. You will now hear from a witness, a very distinguished witness, who will tell you why. Thank you, court. We appreciate that. We'd like to remember that when you vote as well. We will call our first witness, a distinguished advocate for the proposition that it's not merely that the time has come for the dirigible, but the time has always been there and we were too stupid to recognize it. Not stupid at all, the great Dr. J. Henry Glazer. Dr. Glazer, please approach the dock. As far as swearing him in, I will stipulate that this is a very credible person. For those of you who do not appreciate tennis games where you must watch the match going back and forth between the questioner and the volleys on, keep your eyes on Dr. Glazer. A few of you I would like to psychically keep your eye on this court so that they will get the right message. But you need not look at me because all I will be doing is throwing out a ball or two for Dr. Glazer to handle. First, Dr. Glazer, let's share with the audience some of your background. You are indeed a doctor, having studied in particular air law at the University of California. Is that not correct?
The University of Frankfurt.
At the University of Frankfurt, that many years ago, sir.
Well, you really are a hot dog. You didn't get that right.
What I wanted to show you, and you are now convinced the court knows, I do not coach my witnesses. Someone else was not a leading witness. This was to prove that point. We may proceed with credibility. But you didn't grow up in Germany, sir.
Certainly not.
You did some academic work here in the good old United States.
Yes.
And with the exception of Dr. Kronstein, who was one of your mentors at Georgetown University Law School, you also studied at Duke.
Right.
You've also studied at the University of California, receiving a distinguished degree there that also focused a bit on air law. Is that not correct?
Yes, it was the SJD at Berkeley, and the subject of my dissertation was the maritime analogies applicable to the aerospace regime in space.
So you do not come to this court unprepared. Indeed, you also at that time were on a leave of absence from a very distinguished post right near the home here. This was your home for some 20 years, is that not true?
For some 20 years on the station, that's correct.
And what were your roles here on the station, sir?
By day, I was the chief counsel of the NASA Ames Research Center for 9 to 20 years.
That would normally be enough.
And by
But
evening-
there is more?
Yes, by evening.
Please, pray tell.
Well, I will if you stop blowing from the east. Yes. By night, in the fashion of the Swiss, who always kept their uniforms and guns at home, mine was kept in my closet, my office at NASA Ames, and I would put it on every Thursday night, wander across to the judge advocate's place, and I was in the Naval Reserve as a judge advocate. Night and day, I was at Moffett Field.
And you're also a scholar who has written publications dealing with communications, aerospace, and maritime law.
I have dabbled.
And indeed, you currently teach and are an associate dean at San Francisco State University.
Well, I'm sorry you brought that up.
Is that true? Does that disqualify you,
No,
sir?
not at all.
Do you not travel worldly as a result of that role?
I try to.
And in that capacity, have you not many a time thought how much more comfortable your flight would have been had we allowed the dirigible to reach its place in history that it deserves?
No question about it.
Would you share with us what some of those thoughts have been while you were traveling, sir?
Well, I should preface it, number one, we have dirigibles in active service. The Goodyear blimp is one. Virgin Airlines is building a dirigible. The Fiji dirigible that flies around the football game. So they're here. They haven't come and gone. They're here. I guess what we're really focusing on is the rigid airship,
Absolutely.
the large passenger-carrying scheduled airship. And before I get to the superlatives as to what that is, in travel, there is a certain point that crosses my mind. I think to get on with the discussion, it's necessary really to look upon the technology of the entire 20th century vis-a-vis the three great transport tragedies of this century and the nationalistic and political intrusions upon that technology, because there is a common denominator between RMS Titanic, which went down in 1912, the dirigible Hindenburg, the greatest ever built airship, which exploded in 1937, and finally our own Challenger, NASA's shuttle orbiter Challenger, and the tragedy of 1986. There is, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, there is a commonality between those three great transport tragedies.
Doctor, before you proceed with that, and the audience, of course, is intrigued by that,
Okay.
I wish the court to recall that I'm only allowing the discussion of these three tragedies because of your ruling. I would still avert to the fact that we should be able to discuss this on a plane that does not require us to look into those sore spots of history. But having opened the door, we must now proceed. Dr. Glazer, I appreciate your restraint in comparing these.
You know, if we get any more hot air in here, it's going to displace this building wall.
I'm holding on to my seat. To proceed, RMS Titanic, in terms of the technology of the time, it wasn't necessary to equip it with properly life-saving equipment, including lifeboats, because the British Board of Trade considered it unsinkable. And therefore, there weren't sufficient life-saving techniques on RMS Titanic when she went down in 1912. Adolf Hitler chose, in 1935, to fly a hydrogen bomb, which was called the Hindenburg. The first use of helium, which was non-flammable, helium doesn't burn, occurred in 1925. The United States, though, had embargoed the sale of helium. We were the only country which had helium at that time. We embargoed the sale to Nazi Germany. And the result was that Adolf Hitler flew a bomb. Now, the rigid airships before Hindenburg also flew on hydrogen, highly volatile, very unstable, and very explosive. The Graf Zeppelin as well, and I'll speak to that in a moment. All of the German rigid airships flew on hydrogen. But see, hydrogen was the key that made them unsafe. And finally, here again, with Germany overlooking the perils of the time and flying Hindenburg on hydrogen, a nationalistic decision. We then come to Challenger. The commonality intrigues me. In Challenger, NASA would sell its expanded use beyond the astronaut corps, beyond those who were hired to take the risk and paid to take the risk, by analogizing Challenger before the Congress as little more than a truck, a new form of transport, underplaying the ultra-hazardous aspects of that incredible flight instrumentality. And the result was, as we know, here again, through nationalistic political reasons, we flew people on the NASA shuttle who probably shouldn't have been aboard, not apprising the risks at the time. The point is that all of these were corrected. To correct the defects in lighter than air vis-a-vis passenger travel is absolute child's play with today's technology. Let me give you a few superlatives before the Hindenburg closed the book on passenger dirigible flight. The Graf Zeppelin, the first scheduled passenger airship in the world, flown by the Germans, flew 144 flights non-stop from Europe to Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, 144 times before she was retired from service. The Graf Zeppelin flew more than 1 million miles. The Graf Zeppelin circumnavigated the Earth. It took 12 days. The Graf Zeppelin in 1929 flew nonstop from Tokyo, Japan to San Francisco. And ladies and gentlemen of the court, we're speaking of 1920s technology.
Dr. Glazer,
Yes.
before proceeding, I'd like you to identify this exhibit for the record, please.
Shall we?
What is that, and to whom has it been addressed?
This was a biography addressed to me at my law firm, White's Inn in San Francisco.
What is
We
that?
do
What is a
trade.
White's Inn?
Well, it's a think tank which has been involved for some time in the original research in the maritime analogies applicable to the emerging aerospace regime in outer space.
When did you receive that envelope, sir?
I received this envelope 3 days ago from a German student. We do train and instruct students abroad at White's Inn.
Did you advise that student in any manner as to how to post that particular document to you?
Not knowing the student at all.
This
the
was
answer
totally
is no.
unsolicited.
Totally unsolicited.
Would you apprise the court before we introduce it into evidence what appears in the upper right-hand corner as a symbol of that country?
There appears a rigid airship of large dimensions on the postage stamp.
Can you read any identification on that?
It says Graf Zeppelin.
It says what, sir?
Graf Zeppelin, sir.
Oh my God, it is still there.
It is still there.
And it is recognized,
Well, it's recognized in the historical context of the postage stamp, yeah.
and it is respected.
It's very much respected.
So it would be important for this court to realize that other countries have not forgotten the good that came from the Graf Zeppelin.
That's correct.
You may continue, sir.
Looking upon them again and proceeding quickly, as I wish to. If the 1920s technology could accomplish that, my heavens, what could be accomplished today if this form of transport were restored? The two large defects, and I'm a layman, ladies and gentlemen, in lighter than air. One, hydrogen. Well, that's by the boards. No one would fly a large scheduled passenger dirigibles with hydrogen, or helium, which is non-flammable, would be used. And two, the controllability of those very, very large airships. To get a size, an idea of their size, they range between 700 and 800 feet long. Hindenburg was about as tall as a 10-story building. It had 50 staterooms on it, plush. Each stateroom had hot and cold running water. It had a baby grand piano on the Hindenburg. It was the best class of travel, ranking with the Queen Mary, the Rex, the Normandy at the time. It was just as plush and just as incredibly beautiful. So you're speaking of an incredible form of large transporter. In any event, the defects were the gas, purely curable today, and the control. Dirigibles, or the large airships at the time, were controlled as follows. The control gondola, one couldn't control the engines directly from the gondola. You've seen pictures of naval vessels or merchant ships. You had an engine order telegraph. And the OOD, or the officer in charge of that large configuration, would actually, in order to have the engine settings, would have to telegraph aft, just as one does on a vessel. Use his engine order telegraph to telegraph aft, and then a throttleman aft of the dirigible near the tail would then set the throttles to flight. Well, that little lag, that little lead time was a bit of a hazard. And in fact, I think Macon, one of the causes of the Macon crash was some question about the proper signals or signaling on the engine order telegraph. We don't need engine order telegraphs anymore. The engines can be entirely controlled today from the command cabin in a dirigible. And number three, right here at NASA Ames Research Center, we have an incredible type of aircraft called a tilt rotor. This is an airplane. It's in experimental stages. Eventually it will go into civilian use, in which the propellers, the engines themselves, tilt. They can go 180 degrees. And those engines may lift that configuration off the ground dead weight. It is very easy to marry such a configuration to a lighter than airship. It is child's play to do it today. The point I'm making, Your Honor, is that with today's technology, it's a given that it is child's play to eliminate the hazards that existed in the 1920s and 1930s. And finally, to make the final point, why do this now? The average speed of dirigibles, of course, in crosswinds, they made 80 miles an hour. Slow in a sense, faster than ships. Why should we resurrect that form of transport? I hearken again to our experience with the SST. At the time that the British-French Concorde was going into operation, there was a serious debate before the Congress and the U.S. aerospace industry as to whether the United States should also field a commercial SST. The decision was taken against it, but I also am reminded of an incredible article by a colleague at Stanford Law School, Professor Baxter, Why an SST, who penned an incredible article for the Stanford Law Review entitled The SST from Watts to Harlem in 1 hour. We have to begin to ask ourselves, with the hypersonic transport on the horizon, the so-called Orient Express, San Francisco to Tokyo in 1.5 hours. The Orient Express is actually a suborbital space vehicle on the drawing board. We have to begin to ask ourselves, is it speed for speed's sake, which will advance the common weal in our civilization, or is there something else? One who would ride in the Orient Express may have an interesting, scintillating experience. There will be no windows in it. It will glow in the dark because the speed, the friction impinging upon that craft will make it turn red. Should it be a national goal to have breakfast in San Francisco and breakfast in Tokyo? I think not. I do travel a lot, and now travel is by cattle car. We need cattle prods on it. I believe that there should be this return to grace, and I do not believe that this form of transport should be lost to us. The descriptions of Hindenburg on that are incredible. One simply hears the rustle of the wind on the craft and nothing else. So I would conclude with that.
I have a further question because you made reference to the Concorde. And some of the debate in this country to refuse landing privileges to the Concorde was the noise from the jets.
Right.
And some of the debates here in Northern California, vis-a-vis the San Francisco airport, don't fly over my backyard. Aren't you now inviting a very noisy structure to be placed upon the American marketplace?
On the contrary.
Oh. Please share that information.
No, they're relatively very quiet. The impressions of the passengers on Hindenburg, which I recorded in my notes, it's the closest sensation to dreamlike flying through the air. The engines are hardly heard, barely audible at all. The engines can operate either on small gasoline configurations or later diesel, which were far more efficient. Let's talk a little bit about pollution. The airships were entirely non-polluting devices. There is no pollution from airships at all. And they're quiet and they're rather silent. So the opposite is true. There's not that problem.
I am hoping in your discussion about what one can and cannot hear is that the distinguished bench heard everything you said. Boy, if that is true, then other than my courtesy of allowing the host to speak, this case is but over. But court, I will, instead of asking for you to dismiss the case at this time in our favor, allow the gentleman from Santa Clara at least some space to say something. But in fact, you may ask questions of Dr. Glazer if you wish, but I forewarn you, question posed to Dr. Glazer will backfire.
We'll take that, please.
May I have my notes back?
No, not until I see what's coming. Dr. Glazer, you refer to the Hindenburg as one of the three great transport tragedies.
Yep.
How do you define great? I mean, why was the Hindenburg a greater tragedy than the loss of the Akron, which took twice as many human lives?
Totally subjective, because the Hindenburg drew to a close any further flights. That was the end of flights on rigid airships. It ended the passenger trade on rigid airships on that basis. It's a
You're
totally
aware that
subjective
the Navy had already made its decision to end its program of Zeppelins long before the Hindenburg went down.
Well, I'm well aware of it, and when the Chief of Naval Operations after Macon went down, when that episode occurred, the CNO pointedly said, Zeppelin configurations are only good for commercial flight and are not apposite for military uses. So I'm well aware of it.
Okay, so you can see that the lighter-than aircraft has no future as a military weapon system.
Oh, yes, I would concede it has little future as a military weapon system.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, you refer to the tragedy of the Hindenburg really being the unavailability of helium, which you refer to as a nationalistic decision not to sell helium to Nazi Germany.
Correct.
You're well aware, of course, that during World War I, the Germans used Zeppelins in order to bomb the city of London into submission, are you not?
Oh, I am, certainly.
In fact, that was the first London Blitz, wasn't it?
Yes,
It came from dirigibles dropping bombs.
yes.
All right. And are you suggesting that this country should have made helium available to Nazi Germany in 1937?
No, I'm suggesting the opposite. We shouldn't have made helium available to Nazi Germany, but there should have been a pause in continuing to operate. Notwithstanding 144 successful flights to Graf Zeppelin. You know, my thesis was that the Graf Zeppelin was an ultra-hazardous flight instrumentality because of the use of hydrogen. Notwithstanding that, 144 flights were made from nonstop from Berlin to Rio de Janeiro. Still, in my book, it was a hazardous instrumentality. That hazard is removed, if I may extend those remarks.
You may.
Aircraft were far more hazardous than those Zeppelins. To delve into the law a little bit, the case of Rochester Gas Company versus Dunlap, 1933, a New York case. The court ruled, we all know, it's well understood knowledge that airplanes fall from the sky. And in the Dunlap case, the decision was it's res ipsa loquitur in 1933, and any damage caused by airplanes falling from the sky in 1933, which dirigibles never didn't fall from the sky, is res ipsa loquitur strict liability. That was changed in another landmark case of Wood versus United Airlines, 1961 is later that, where the courts finally said, and this is where the lighter than air never had the chance. Now the technology in heavier than air has reached the point in passenger travel where, quote, airplanes no longer fall from the sky and the plaintiff has to demonstrate negligence. We never had that sequence with lighter than air.
Well, the fact remains, does it not, Dr. Glazer, that the American airship program had switched to helium 12 years before the Hindenburg went down.
That's correct.
And the fact that the Akron was filled with helium didn't prevent its tragic crash into the Atlantic in 1933.
Well, I have to register objection not. I have to register whether it's a valid assumption that experience in military dirigibles are entirely opposite to experience in civilian-type passenger-carrying scheduled dirigibles. First of all, the Akron...
Isn't it a fact that the major cause in the disaster of the Akron, the major cause in the disaster of the Shenandoah, many of the other American airships that went down, was simply bad weather?
No, the major cause was human error in flying the Akron into the worst storm in 10 years in the state of New Jersey and along its coast. It was reported to be the worst storm in 10 years. Akron flew right directly into that storm. That is the cause of the tragedy, but I would tell you at the same time
Is
flying...
Is that true of the Shenandoah, too?
Well, flying a heavier-than-air configuration of the worst storm in 10 years on the New Jersey coast would have had the same effect, if not worse. It couldn't be worse.
Well, isn't it a fact that the Akron didn't deliberately fly into that storm, but was driven into that storm by the wind?
By bad meteorological information received in advance. No, it wasn't driven into the storm. It was flown into the storm. Now,
You have also drawn an analogy to the Titanic and to the Challenger. Did either of those tragedies have anything to do with bad weather conditions?
no.
Now, when you tell us that you believe lighter-than-air airships had a future in terms of the transportation of passengers, how many passengers did the Hindenburg carry?
The Hindenburg carried 50 passengers in 50 staterooms with hot and cold running water, a baby grand piano, 2 lounges, one of which was 75 feet long. If you're saying, could we crowd more, could we make them cattle cars similar to our own, I guess we could.
Incidentally, that baby grand piano was made of aluminum, wasn't it?
Don't know.
Have you ever heard a tune played on an aluminum piano?
Only in Frank Winston's office.
Those 50 passengers were accompanied by a crew. Actually, there were only 38 passengers when the Hindenburg went down.
That's right.
Accompanied by a crew of 59. Is that correct?
I believe that's true.
And it took those passengers about 50 hours to cross the Atlantic.
Yes.
Today, what do you think it would cost if we were flying Zeppelin dirigibles across the Atlantic with a crew of 60 to service 40 or 50 passengers? How expensive do you think that would be?
I object to that question because no one has suggested that Dr. Blazer's testimony is that we examine one with 38 or 40. That's a hypothetical that has no bearing.
I'd like to say, though, clearly with modern technology, where it is no longer necessary to ring up engine order telegraphs and have a throttleman at the rear, at the end of the ship, manually set the throttles. I would say clearly with modern technology, we wouldn't need anywhere near that number of people on a modern dirigible.
With modern technology, have we overcome the limits on the lifting power of helium? Can we lift more than a pound now with 45 cubic feet of helium?
No, we can't, but the lifting capacity of those large airships was enormous. I'm not an expert.
And to increase their lifting capacity, they would simply have to be larger airships, wouldn't they?
Yes.
Right. Now, the exhibit that was referred to with the Graf Zeppelin stamp, was that delivered to you airmail?
I think so.
Okay, and it didn't come to you on a Zeppelin, did it? In fact, if it had been sent by Zeppelin, you would still be waiting for its arrival. Thank you.
Redirect. Yes. I would wish for my adversary's sake that he had not asked that last question. We are taught in law school never to ask a question unless you know what the answer will be, and I won't go through the horrible example that they give us.
Your Honor, in our law school, we teach counsel to ask questions instead of make speeches. So this continual speech making by counsel, let him ask his question.
Dr. Glazer, this is definitely within the scope of examination. The last question from the dean made reference to airmail. Would you share with this audience the military experience of the Army in becoming our airmail lifters in the 30s and why that experiment failed?
Well, there was difficulty in airplanes falling from the sky in the 30s, as the courts so clearly pointed out, and much of the mail was lost.
And it was the military that had been selected. It's not the civilians who have since that day delivered airmail.
Yeah, historically, though, the first airmail service on the planet was performed by the Graf Zeppelin. She carried the mails from Europe to the New World.
And so in our new society, we could entrust the mails. How relevant is that, by the way, and I won't make an argument at all, to discuss the ability of the ship to carry mail in a day where we have satellite communications? Could you explore a little how relevant it is that he wants to send his messages? His messages actually do travel very slowly because they don't sink into the court. But is it a fact that today we wouldn't be expected to use that to send a commercial message or even a romantic message?
Well, if they're only going to carry the mail, if they're not going to have females, how can they have a romantic?
I never.
Is the court trying to ask the questions now? We haven't fully focused right now.
I know we're talking about the mail, and then you brought in romanticism.
If you're trying to institute some kind of sexual harassment, assuming I have pronounced it correctly, but may the doctor please finish with his testimony rather than Judge Choppelas's chopping. And as a matter of fact, Choppelas, the chop has been outlawed now, so it's not proper to use the chop.
For those of us whose sentiments are still a little to the right of the ancient Egyptian pharaohs, and not enamored with satellite technology necessarily, or fax machines, I leave it with this. There is a certain amount of grace in having delivered the mail by this slow, circuitous route in the past. Because although it's a question that can't be answered, I have asked myself many times whether the Constitution or the Declaration of Independence ever could have been drafted if we hadn't lived in a world of fax machines and Xerox machines. So there's even something to be said for the old way of delivering the mail. And I think that that's the case. I prefer to get a letter and not a fax.
In other words, Dr. Glazer, you would not kill the messenger.
Oh, no, not at all.
No further questions.
One brief question on redirect. Mr. Winston has referred repeatedly to airplanes falling from the sky. Are you aware that within the last 2 years, the Goodyear blimp in Los Angeles fell from the sky?
Yes.
And the reason it fell from the sky is because it was struck broadside by a radio-controlled model airplane. Is that not correct?
That's correct. And we also had Los Angeles crazy shooting at it.
But that wasn't why it fell from the sky. Thank you.
One final question. Is there a similarity between a controlled, what did you call it, Doctor?
Model airplane.
Controlled model airplane and a, quote, controlled fire. Like there was a controlled fire last week, but it just got out of control. So the fact that it is controlled does not necessarily mean it is controlled.
We also have large airplanes, passenger planes falling from the sky.
No.
When crows or birds fly into the jet engine. So model airplanes, birds flying into jets.
You mean they're not safe?
Not safe.
Cancel my reservation, please. Taking a dirigible. No further questions.
Thank you very much, sir. Can I ask a question? Sir. Doctor, I want to ask you a question. Do you think technologically in the future that they might be able to develop some type of a element that would be even lighter than helium? I mean, for purposes of our discussion.
I think the next witness may have information. From my limited knowledge, no, gas, naturally, gas is gas.
Then let me ask you my next question.
Whether there could be a mixture of something that might be in between non-flammable, I don't have the confidence.
The reason is the professor was asking you questions about the economic feasibility of dirigibles. And it's apparently, I don't know, but apparently the Hindenburg had 52 passengers and 60 crewmen, and you had indicated they might be able to make it a cattle car.
Sure.
To have a commercial enterprise, what do you think that they could do? They could cut down the crew, which you indicated because of modern technology, and then could they increase the people on a dirigible?
Well, no, I would analogize its use in the future to that of the Simplon Orient Express. And you have to face it in terms of mass transit. No matter what technologies we may apply to the dirigible, it's not going to compete with airplanes or modes of travel in terms of mass transit. But in terms of transportation with a certain amount of grace, I think there's a future. I think there's a big future in it. Just as the Queen Elizabeth, the cruise line, the Simplon Orient Express, these are technologies, of course, that weren't cut off and weren't lost. And everyone can save up. My wife and I saved our pennies for a long time to go first class on the Queen Elizabeth. And I think that would be the case. This technology, this type of flight should not be lost. We should be able to experience it because it's so different and so wonderful.
Judge, since you raised the issue, the Orient Express is not the kind of mass transit that one would expect.
It's not mass.
But would you share with the audience how long in advance one must book, which gives an idea of how popular it may still be?
A year. Sure.
A year in advance for what he would say people might not be able to
It would
afford
just
to
be,
choose.
the future dirigible would just be an incredibly elegant way to travel. An incredible experience, I've never been aboard one, but based upon the descriptions of flight for those who have, the closest thing to a dreamlike state of flying.
Thank you, sir. Any further evidence on your behalf?
Oh, there's a great deal of evidence, but as a courtesy, since I'm in his hometown, I'd like him to have a chance to say something.
Thank you, sir. Now you're going to have the first witness,
I think
Would
you got
call-
a stacked deck, Frank. They
call
just moved the
Richard
witness
Neal.
chair closer to us.
That was for some technology
Oh, all
reasons,
right.
and apparently the dean doesn't recognize yet technology has a place.
It'll be stipulated that this witness is speaking only the truth, so the oath will be unnecessary. Would you tell us your name, please?
Richard Deal, D-E-A-L.
And are you also known as Lucky Deal?
Some people call me that.
How did you pick up that nickname?
Well, tragic way, actually. I was on the crew of the Shenandoah, which is, it's been pointed out, went down in 1925. A friend of mine, Ralph Joffre, begged me to take my place on that flight because he was going to fly over his hometown. And so I let him go in my place, and he died.
He was killed in the crash of the
I
Shenandoah?
was killed in the crash.
Okay. And you later married his widow?
That's correct. I married Gertrude Joffre 5 years after the crash.
Now, you served in the U.S. Navy Bureau of Aeronautics for over 10 years, is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
Okay. So you came on in this Navy service actually at the time the Shenandoah was commissioned.
That's right.
Tell us about the Shenandoah.
Well, the Shenandoah was built to the specifications of a German ship, and because of the difference in lifting capacity, pointed out, Helium has 92.6% lifting capacity of hydrogen. They lengthened the ship by, I think it's 10 meters, which is about 40 feet. And it had a control car that was suspended from the front of the ship The engine cars were outboard on engine nacelles. It was the first American-built rigid dirigible. We had one that we were going to buy from England, that was built in England, and that broke up on a test flight, broke right in the middle, and then dropped down to the ground into the river actually.
Okay. That British airship was the ZR-2?
That's correct. The U.S. designation for dirigibles was ZR. That stood for Zeppelin Rigid. And all told, we had 5. The first one...
Shenandoah was ZR-1?
ZR-1, that's correct. And ZR-2 was the English made, which had their designation, their R number. It was R38 in their nomenclature. And then the ZR-3 was the Los Angeles, which was built by Germany, turned over to the United States as part of the war reparations. And that was the only one of the 5 that we owned that survived. It was decommissioned in 1932.
Okay, so the ZR-3 was the only one of the 5
That's correct.
rigid Zeppelins commissioned by the U.S. Navy that did not crash.
That's correct. ZR-4 was the Akron, went down in April of 33, and ZR-5 was a Macon, went down just a little under 2 years later.
In the Pacific.
Right.
Now, despite the fact the ZR-3 never went down, were there some mishaps with the Los Angeles?
There were a couple of pretty spectacular ones. One, it was on a mast. It was a high mooring mast. Later, I think this was the episode that convinced them that mooring masts had to be lower so the ship would be down on the ground. Wind caught up the tail of it, and it caused it to stand, rose up slowly while it was still fastened to the mast by its nose, and it went through 180 degrees. No one was injured, but anything that was loose that was inside the ship came crashing down, fell through the nose, fabric on the nose, onto the ground, tools.
Were there photographs taken of the ZR-3 in
been a
Los
long
Angeles
time,
actually
but
standing on its nose?
That's years later. As I recall, the Navy tried to suppress those pictures, but they're you can see them now.
Okay.
There was another time with the Los Angeles when it was being pulled down to the ground, and of course to land a dirigible you have to have a lot of men on the ground to help pull it down. These men were hanging onto a handrail that was on the outside of the control car, and the commander had given the order to let go of the lines. There was a gust of wind, and they were going to have to let the ship go up again. These men didn't hear that command, and there were 8 of them that were hanging on outside as the ship rose. And they had to pull them in through the windows of the control cabin one by one. They didn't lose anybody.
Your Honor, I would like to inject here that the Dean in his real life has been on committees urging that we recognize gender bias in the courtroom, yet he brings out a witness who talks solely of the men on the ground, without realizing that there are others who could have performed those tasks and could still today if we were to return. So could you please admonish the counsel to sex bias, gender bias?
I was about to say, Your Honor, that the duty on the on the big ridges, as we call them, was the best student in this man's name. I see him getting a stony stare from counsel over there, but
Deservedly.
I did not intend that as harassment.
All right. The court will so note, you may proceed.
All right. Well, let's move on to ZR4. ZR4 was the acronym, is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
And you were actually on board the acronym throughout much of its life as a Navy vessel, is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
Did you actually fly across country on the acronym?
Yes, we flew. It was flown from the East Coast to the West Coast in May, I think it was, of 1932.
And there was another famous mishap in attempting to bring the Akron in San Diego?
Correct, that's correct.
You want to describe what happened?
Well, it was the same kind of situation where they were bringing the ship down and it got caught up with a gust of wind. And there were 3 men on lines that were among the ground crew there. 3 of them that were pulled up into the air. 2 of them fell, must have been about 150 feet, and 2 of them were killed. The 3rd man managed to cling to a wooden spider, they called it. It was a sort of a little arrangement that was used in handling the line on the ground. And so he was able to hang on to it, but he was being trailed by the airships as it went forward. And the problem was that the line that this spider was on, that he was riding on, was attached to a 1-inch steel cable. And the only way to haul him up would have been to bypass that steel cable, because it couldn't have been wound up on the winch that they had in the nose of the ship. So I said I'd see what I could do to help him, and they lowered me in a bosun's chair from the nose of the ship, and I took a line down and attached it to the smaller line that the spider was on. They cut loose the steel cable, and they were able to take the man up. And he was very glad to get on board.
Were you on board the Akron on its final flight?
That's correct, I was.
Who else was on board that flight?
Well, Admiral Moffett was on board. Of course, he was a big champion of dirigibles. Commander Frank McCord was commanding officer. His executive officer was Lieutenant Commander Herbert Wiley. He was one of the 3 survivors. And there were 76 men on board.
Now, could you tell us what happened in that flight? Did the Akron actually deliberately fly into one of the worst Atlantic storms in history?
That's the way it seemed to turn out. They knew that there was some heavy weather out there, but they didn't think it was going to be that bad. And Commander Wiley wanted to go to the west, and Captain McCord said no. He'd seen some lightning over there, and he kept going north. And the storm got worse and worse, and I guess about the main trouble was the fact that in a storm, your air pressure, your barometric pressure changes. And at that time, the only height recording device, the altimeter, was the barometric kind, where you set the instrument according to the air pressure where you take it off, then you can correct it with later information. The Akron never got later information. The result was that the altimeter at all times in this storm was showing that we were several hundred feet higher than we actually were. And it was dark. The engines, of course, were driving the ship forward. And the command was given to raise the ship to the elevators. And later they figured what happened was when they raised the elevators, that had the effect of depressing the tail of the ship. The altimeter showed several hundred feet, but actually we were right down on the water. So when they raised the ship, they just shoved the tail into the water, and that was the end of it. It ripped the lower fin off. And then it was all over. Then the girders started breaking in the main framework there, and there was no saving the ship after that.
So it actually went down in the water.
Went down in the water, yeah.
How did you manage to survive that?
Well, I'm still not sure. I was in the crew's quarters, or in the area of the crew's quarters on the starboard keel. See, there were two keels that ran the length of the ship. They were tall enough to walk through. And then along the side, in certain places, they'd have the crew's quarters. The airplane hangar was roughly amidships. I was in one of these keels, the starboard keel, when the ship hit the water. First, I was trapped. There was some of the rigging wire in there was caught on my leg, but I was able to free myself. I was able to get clear of the ship, and I saw these three men hanging onto one of the gas tanks that had broken loose. It was empty. And one of the men pulled me on, so I hung on with him. There were four of us. There was Uelmen, he was the one who saved me. And there was Bob Copeland, he was a radio operator. And then there was Lucius Lutan, who was a mechanic. Well, I don't know how long we were out there. Like I say, it was dark, the water was like freezing cold. Lutan, we lost him. And finally there was a German tanker. Fortunately, he was nearby. And they saw that the ship was in distress. And they picked up Commander Wiley, he swam away from the ship, stayed in the water. He actually didn't have anything to, object to cling to. He was a very powerful man. And they saved him. They pulled aboard the three of us around that gas tank. And Copeland died on the rescue vessel. That left just me and Uelmen and Commander Wiley.
That was quite a celebrated rescue. In fact, after you were brought back to the United States, you were taken to the White House to meet President Roosevelt?
We met President Roosevelt, the three of us. That was quite an event.
Actually, the Akron had a sister ship, is that correct?
That's correct.
And that was ZR-5, the Macon. We have an exhibit on the wall back there. If you could refer to that.
Okay, this Well, it's kind of small to see here, but there were 36 girders that ran the length of the ship. Now, this ship was constructed of what they call duralumin, which is an alloy. It's primarily aluminum, but there's some other metals in there. It makes it lighter than steel, but it's almost structurally as strong. The control car is here, and unlike the Shenandoah, where the control car hung below the ship itself, this was part of the ship here. These keels ran along the side near the bottom here. The aircraft compartment was about in here, and it carried 5 airplanes. They were very small, single-seater biplanes, and they had a sort of a hook on the top. And they could, inside the dirigible, they just hung them up like hats in a hat rack there. They were all racked together there. And they'd let them down on sort of a crane below the ship, and the pilot would cut loose from this crane or derrick and take off. And then coming back, he'd fly up beneath the ship, match his speed to the dirigible, and hook on, and they'd pull them back up.
So the Akron and the Macon were really floating aircraft.
Floating aircraft carriers, and that was supposed to be their big value, that they could scout thousands and thousands of square miles of ocean or land or whatever.
Now, is that representation drawn to scale?
This is to scale. Up here is the relative size of the Hindenburg, which is not much more, about 20 feet longer, 18, 20 feet longer. Here's a Goodyear blimp showing the relative size.
So you could fit about 20 or 30 Goodyear blimps into the Akron or Macon.
Looks that way, yeah. Wouldn't have much room left for anything else on.
Now, to the left, there's another exhibit which lists each of the great dirigible disasters in chronological order. You've already told us about ZR2 that went down in England, loss of life 44 out of the 49 on board.
That's correct, yes.
The Roma, was that a American vessel?
I saw that one go down. That was the Italian-built ship. It was what they call a semi-rigid. It had a framework, a triangular framework that went the whole length of the ship, and then the main part of the ship, what they call the envelope, was above that, and the control car and the engine gondolas were on this keel. It was a hydrogen ship, and there was something went wrong with the control cables, and it went into a dive, and it hit some high tension lines, and it exploded with the hydrogen.
All right, that was operated by the U.S. Army.
That's correct. That
Went
was
down
an Army ship.
near Langley, Virginia.
Right.
33 out of 44 on board were killed. The Dixmude. That was a French vessel?
It was French. It was built by the Germans and turned over to the French after the war. And they never really knew for sure what happened. There were a couple of traces. Presumably it exploded and went down in the Mediterranean, but they never recovered any bodies.
Was the speculation it had been hit by lightning?
That was the story at the time, but no one really knows.
Okay. The Shenandoah you've already told us about. What about the Italian?
I just like to mention about the Shenandoah. It was flown into a storm, what was called a line squall, and it got caught in two opposing blasts of wind and was literally just wrenched in two. And it broke into pieces, and the control car fell away. And you see how many,
14 of the 43 on board?
right.
How about the Italian?
The Italian was an Italian ship. Again, it was a semi-rigid dirigible. It flew over the North Pole and was forced down by weather on an ice floe. There's been a movie, I think, recently, The Red Tent, about the survivors of the Italian. And many more people were lost in rescue attempts than were lost in the airship itself.
And the R-101 was a British
That
vessel?
was a British ship that was bad judgment again, I think. It hadn't been completely tested. Apparently there were some politics in the thing, and they wanted to make a showing with it. And it was forced down in a storm over France, and it was on its way to India with the Viceroy of India.
Actually, the newly appointed Viceroy of India was
Right.
killed in the
Right.
crash of the R-101. Is that
Yeah.
correct?
Then we got the Akron and the Macon.
Let's talk a moment about the Macon. The Macon was actually stationed right here at
That's
Moffett
correct.
Field. Is that correct?
Yes.
Do you want to explain to us what happened?
Well, on a flight to maneuvers from Sunnyvale, maneuvers that were in the Caribbean, I think, there was, it hit a windstorm, and it badly damaged one of these, the main rings here, this position right here. It broke some girders, and they actually had to splint the thing with planks. The chief petty officer on there had insisted on having these planks on board just in case something like that happened. So they repaired it when it got back to Sunnyvale here, but they never repaired it completely. The parts were shipped from the Graf Zeppelin factory, and they repaired the lower part of it, but not this upper part where the upper fin is attached. When it went out in February of 1935 for the war games with the Pacific Fleet, was returning, and apparently this ring here gave way, and this fin crumpled, and it punctured the 3 gas cells to the rear of the ship here. The reaction was that, the commander had to make decisions, under the pressure of the situation. What they wound up doing was releasing ballast so that the ship would rise, but they released so much ballast that the ship rose too high. It rose above what they call pressured height. And that's the height at which the pressure within the gas cells equals the atmospheric pressure, and there are automatic valves on the gas cells that release the helium. Pressure height was about 2,800 feet, and they actually went about 2,000 feet above that. And when they did that, they were losing helium, and when that happened, the ship lost its buoyancy and came down in the sea. And at that time, there were plenty of vessels around to rescue the crew.
Okay.
2 men were lost.
But the Macon went down in the Pacific.
That's correct.
And wasn't there just a recent discovery of the remains of the
I
Macon
think they did find one section, one piece of it.
within the last 4 or 5 years?
Yeah, more recent than that.
And then we have the final disaster, which was actually the 5th greatest disaster in terms of human life, the Hindenburg. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay. And we all pretty well know what happened to the Hindenburg. Do you want to comment on that at all?
Well, I don't think anyone ever will know for sure just what happened. One theory was sabotage, one theory was lightning, static electricity, whatever.
Objection, Your Honor. The coach here said that we all know what happened, and the expert has responded that no one knows what happened.
Well, we all know it burned, but we don't know the cause of that fire, do we?
As far as I'm concerned, we never found out.
With the court's permission, we do have a very brief section of videotape so we can all watch what happened to the Hindenburg. It also portrays the dramatic liftoff of the Akron and San Diego, the incident that the witness referred to where the sailors were hauled aloft. With the court's permission.
Yes, may I be heard on that? Yes, sir. I would object to introducing to this audience or this jury a videotape. And I direct my remarks particularly to Judge Choppelas, because 2 days ago at a court hearing of the Court of Historical Review, I had a live witness by videotape from Albany testifying on behalf of the late, great General Benedict Arnold. Now, at the conclusion of her video testimony, her testimony was ruled out of order because she wasn't there to be cross-examined. I would like to urge this court to rule, along with Judge Choppelas, who's already ruled for us, that if I can't cross-examine the video, you cannot introduce the video. No further statement?
Well, first, Mr. Winston,
Yeah.
I know you were there.
Of course I'm
but
a recipient.
I did consider the evidence that was on the video, and I did tell Justice Newsom that he could cross-examine the television set.
No, that was
Chose not to at the time.
That was not your ruling, sir.
Why don't we make a ruling as long as the audience can see the video too?
Well, I'll stipulate the following. Let us allow this so the audience can enjoy it, and I would ask it to be shown this way only, so that there's no possibility that the judges could be tainted by seeing this prejudicial.
Well, in that case, then I would ask that the judges join the audience.
No. They're just fine.
Is there sound?
Yes, there is. It's very
Do
brief.
they use words that have more than 6 letters? Because I don't think Mr. Winston will understand those words.
I believe they're very, it's designed for 6th grade levels.
And Rubber Company of Akron, Ohio, to build 2 state-of-the-art airships, the Akron and the Macon. The Akron contained 8 million cubic feet of helium. It was over 2 football fields in length. The 8 inboard engines could cruise at 70 miles an hour for up to 75 hours. To compensate for weight lost from burning off fuel, water was recovered from the engine exhausts. In 1931, there were great expectations for the new airships.
At that time, you have to remember that the Navy badly needed some surveillance of the really broad ocean area. Yet to provide this, they just sort of started off. The seaplanes didn't have the legs to do it with. It was really a device that was badly needed.
The Akron and the Macon were flying aircraft carriers with room for 5 planes inside their hulls.
And the idea is these planes, there would be 4 of them out at one time, 2 on each side of the airship, 100 miles apart. So you were sweeping a 400-mile width area as you went along. And of course, this greatly extended the amount of area you could cover in surveillance.
But the Akron seemed ill-fated. A well-publicized accident showed how difficult it was to land the huge, buoyant airship, even with the help of over 200 sailors.
In 1932, while she was attempting to moor, a gust of wind swept her skyward so suddenly that 3 men of her ground crew were pulled high into the air. The grip of one man loosened, and he fell to his death. The second man followed him to destruction, but the third crewman hung on and was saved.
It was a grand and glorious feeling to get inside once more.
During a visit by government observers, Catherine crushed her fin, causing further embarrassment to the Navy. Before they could prove their worth as long-distance scouts, both airships were sunk in storms at sea. The loss of the Akron and Macon ended American ambitions to build giant, rigid airships. Back in Germany, the Zeppelin company was enjoying great success with its passenger-carrying airship, the Graf Zeppelin. The accommodations were more comfortable than on any earlier airship. There were 10 staterooms for 20 passengers, all with windows that could open on a world just a few hundred feet below. Food and service were first class. As one satisfied passenger commented, "On a plane you fly, but on the Graf you voyage." The Graf offered the first transatlantic flights to New York and Rio. The driving force behind the Zeppelin company was Hugo Echner.
We had a wonderful flight in a record time of about 50 hours from coast to coast. That is nearly half the time the fastest steamers need. I admit we had to make the flight under very favorable weather conditions, but I am convinced under all weather conditions, even on the most unfavorable, we will be able to make the flight in all regularity and safety. Thank you.
By 1935, Echner's plans to build the world's largest and most luxurious commercial airship were nearing completion. The 16 gas bags were to be filled with helium, purchased from the United States. But huge construction costs forced the Zeppelin company to forfeit control to the German government. The United States, fearing that the Nazis would use the new airship for military purposes, refused to export any helium. So the Hindenburg was filled with hydrogen. The first flight of the 1937 flying season offered 50 passengers the fast chance of crossing the Atlantic. One of the Hindenburg's crew was Richard Kalmer.
Eine Luftschifffahrt mit dem Hindenburg, das war eine
A trip on the Hindenburg was a wonderful experience. Food was excellent. Even the crew ate the same meals as the paying passengers. Unlike travel by boat, airship passengers never became seasick. This was an important consideration for travelers when choosing between a steamer or an airship. The chairs and tables were not fixed to the floor. You could place a glass of water on a table without it moving. This was the real proof of how smooth it was to fly on an airship.
A large crowd had assembled in Lakehurst, New Jersey to greet the Hindenburg's arrival on May 6, 1937. There were news cameramen. Radio reporter Herb Morrison was covering the event live.
It's practically standing still now. They've dropped
ropes out of the nose of the ship has been taken a hold of down on the field by a number of men. The back motors of the ship are just holding it just enough to keep it from... It bursts into flames. And it's crashing. Oh, it's a terrific crash, ladies and gentlemen. The smoke and the flames now, and the frame is crashing to the ground. Oh, the humanity and all the...
Und ich bin als Erster da raus und bin
I was the first out and ran for the fire department.
Feuerwehr. Ich habe ja einen
I think I set a world record running the 100 meters. It was high time to get out of there. Shortly afterwards, the whole ship began to collapse and I would certainly have been injured or killed. In 1 minute, the whole ship was totally destroyed.
It was never discovered what caused the hydrogen to explode. Amazingly, only 35 of the 97 people on board were killed, the only passenger losses that ever occurred on a Zeppelin. But these newsreel images shown around the world spelled the end of the giant passenger-carrying airship.
It's the greatest of miracles that anyone came out of the disaster alive.
That concludes our case, Your Honor.
Very interesting recitation, Mr. Deal. No time have I heard you say anything but the finest for the effort in creating and utilizing these airships. The question has not been posed to you, is there a reason we should not adopt Dr. Glazer's style and the showing of the comfort that existed by these kinds of ships?
I think there is a reason not to do this. Well, so far, as has been pointed out, the disasters, with the possible exception of the Hindenburg, are, at least for the U.S. ships, are traceable to human error. They were preventable. And unless some technological means can be found to overcome human error, I think the same things are going to happen. I just don't think they're going to work.
Mr. Dio, you would abolish the creation and use of the hobby, the bungee cord. Is that not correct? Since as recently as yesterday, a 21-year-old lady fell to her death attempting to jump with a bungee cord.
Well, that's a highly individual choice.
But the result was the disaster of which you speak, the loss of a life for using an instrumentality of travel. And not being morbid, but fixing it closer to home. Within 3 miles from here is a museum that was created 4 or 5 years ago and will be a legend to the Lakefield Graham, the amphitheater in Mountain View. Killed last night in a helicopter crash in Sonoma County. Please share with us, Mr. Deal, how soon shall we terminate the use of helicopters?
I'm not going to say we should do away with helicopters, but I see a vast difference between individual aircraft like that and massive aircraft like Dirigible.
Would you tell us what the difference is?
Well, there's more at stake, I think, in a Dirigible in terms of size for one thing, and manageability, and the possibility for human error. It's kind of hard to equate the two. I mean, I'm trying to think of an analogy to draw here. I mean,
Maybe I can help you. Are you from the Midwest?
Well, originally.
Yeah. In the fields of Iowa, less than 4 years ago, a dramatic photo, just like on this TV showing, was a plane rolling over and over. Some lived, some did not. When's the last time you took a flight? Commercial flight?
About a month ago.
You gave us a scenario of being on the ship when there was a little dispute between those in control over going east or going south. Is that correct?
Well, I don't know if you call it a dispute. Are you referring to the Akron?
Sure.
There was a difference of opinion as to which was the better course.
Well, I want to tell you that Dr. Glazer says he's not a technical expert. He sure is more than I. Either of them ever think of going back? Forget south and east. Did anyone ever think about turning the ship around and getting out of it? I mean, that's what I do because I'm not technological. Was there any such discussion?
Well, we learned later that because...
I believe if the court would ask him to answer the question, not what they learned later, he was present at the time. Did anybody talk about going back?
Question, I don't think that would have been practical.
I didn't ask whether it would be practical. Did anybody even think of it or discuss it? Was that an option that they considered?
I was not in the control car at the time. I don't know what the dialogue was between the officers. I was in the...
Then I submit that we strike his testimony as to what the dialogue was, since he is just now established. He never heard of it. Well, let me go on. Would you rule on that?
Yes, your motion is granted. To do what?
To strike his testimony of what someone else might have said that he did not hear. Now, when, well, let's talk about this going backwards just a moment. The picture that you have, the exhibit, which is the top airship there?
The top airship is the Hindenburg.
Okay. Did it ever fly backwards? I ask that, not being facetious, Your Honor, but the swastika is on backwards. So why would the ship fly backwards?
Funny you should mention that. I noticed that too.
Yeah. All right, you may be seated.
Dyslexic artist.
Did you ever testify before any body, Congress, military, that we should abolish our use of rigid dirigibles?
No, sir, I didn't. Because...
Okay, would you explain to this body why 10 years, 30 years later, you come forward to make an allegation that you never made at the time it happened?
Well, for one thing, there has been much that has been discovered, that has come to light about the circumstances of these crashes that were not known at the time. At the time of the inquiry into the Akron disaster, all I could testify was about what I experienced. Later on, various researchers have put together accounts of this flight in the last hours. We found out all these things that happened, the things that didn't happen, and
aren't you aware of studies today that take into account what occurred in the 30s, recognize the improvements we have in technology in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, certainly going a little bit further than coast to coast, like into the next orbit, that we could now re-examine and explore and reinstitute the model of the rigid dirigible?
well, I won't say that it couldn't be done experimentally, but my gut feeling is that it would not prove successful once they did it.
Well, is that your major reason for opposition, is that it might not prove successful even if undertaken?
Well, it just
Not probably scientific now, but just how you feel.
Well, I think to postulate the kind of situation that you're describing where technology can overcome these things is, I think that's going pretty far out. I'm not willing to concede that this could be done. I think with an object of this size and with the requirements, the lifting requirements and everything, I don't think it could be done.
I have no other questions at this time of this witness.
Okay, you may step down, sir. Thank you very much. That concludes the testimony?
That concludes our case.
We have a rebuttal witness.
All right, sir.
My pleasure to call Commander Lundy Moore. Commander Lundy Moore. Commander's more experience in this area and this arena is sufficient to satisfy all that he is credible, believable, and the oath will be waived by him.
My name is Lundy Moore. I'm a retired commander. Apparently I'm going to be the straight man on this.
Commander from what institution, what
As a graduate of
agency?
the U.S. Naval Academy, I was a flight officer for 21 years, 9 years spent in airships, 4,000 hours in command of airships of 1 billion cubic feet and greater.
1 billion cubic
1
feet?
billion cubic feet and greater.
How does that compare to, is it 8 million that they're talking about for the
Considerably
Helium?
smaller, but comparable to the Los Angeles. I was an airship test pilot for 3 years and a consultant to the Department of DARPA for 3 years.
I certainly would not wish you to break your oath of secrecy to our government that does everything secret-wise. But are you permitted to share with us anything regarding the infrastructure and the battle over whether we could even re-explore or examine the use of the dirigible, the rigid dirigible?
Well, I believe we can presume that if the existing airship they're working on proves successful, that they will indeed reinvent the airship. It has enormous capabilities, which were shown, but were not permitted to be demonstrated to unbiased people.
Commander, maybe there's a visual there that warriors use, graph. Not the Zeppelin graph, but just a graph. And it seems to suggest that some people lost their lives. Now, from your experience and as a student of this subject, do those represent the only flights that those aircraft, CR 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, ever took?
No, that's a very small percentage of the flights of those.
You're kidding. Then that would be misleading for them to suggest that that set some sort of pattern. How would you relate that? Those are 10 or so accidents. Were there at least 25 flights collectively over the 38 years of that chart?
Oh, at least.
At least. Would you venture, not a guess, but an understanding from your research of what the relationship is between the number of flights that they have described and the number of flights that occurred with those particular aircraft?
Well, I know the ZR4 and ZR5 had several flights. I have charts that show those flights. I could produce those if the court so desires.
I would take your word.
But I would also explain that the Germans had built 126 Zeppelins, and only 2 went down due to weather. Further, I would also to state that the Goodyear Corporation ran a private airline of sorts until 1940, flew 5 million miles, 400,000 passengers without fatality. In the subsequent 50 years, we've probably flown another 1 million passengers at least without fatality.
You're talking about 1 million passengers. Those collectively are under 1,000 passengers. So then you're not really persuaded by that form of argument that we should stand still or regress.
No, I think, especially when you notice that they are military airships, primarily that suffer the loss.
Excuse me. One of the members of the panel still has an allegiance. Could you be a little more colorful when you describe the different institutions, not really label the military? Is there another way to say it?
Government? Service?
Perhaps, yes. No offense, Your Honor. No. Now you may proceed.
Many times we could have shown the capability of the airship were it not for the hatred that Dr. Glazer mentioned, the political climate. Many times the airship was scheduled for demonstration flights. I remember one where we scheduled to spend 2 months on station off of Cape May, off of New Jersey, maintain 24 hours for the months of February and March, which are the worst months for weather. There were 4 airships to do it. They missed 20 minutes in the worst kinds of weather. Unfortunately, the results of that were held in Sink Plant Fleet and not transmitted to Mr. McNamara when he was Secretary of Defense, so he could not make a decision unbiasedly on airships.
Are you suggesting that there's been some withholding of information by our intelligence or military? Are you suggesting that, sir?
I can only state the facts that I know.
We'll deal with the facts. That's what you know.
Another case in point would be the use that NASA wanted to make of airships. They wanted them to pick up nose cones off of Wallops Island. When the airship was used for testing the procedures, and when it was scheduled to do a demonstration pickup, it was stopped by Sink Land Fleet. It was also desired to use airships for spectrographic photography above the haze layer, above the atmospheric haze. We had airships available with stabilized platforms on top of them. We could have done it without interfering. They were prevented. Bernal Braun wanted to use the airship to transport missiles. We did the engineering, but were prevented by the Navy from demonstrating their capability. Among some of those political issues.
At this point in the proceedings, counsel will share with the audience a trick that lawyers will often do, and then perform the trick. In order to avoid the risk that our opposing counsel will try to show some form of bias from this witness, I will ask the question so I soften the blow that it comes as some kind of a target. We are discussing, Commander, a form of travel that talks about displacing air. Is that not correct?
That's true.
Is it true that you have been displaced in your career by virtue of the government decisions to no longer allow the aircraft that you had 4,000 hours?
I must admit that when airships were canceled, I lost a great deal of interest in my career.
Does that have any influence whatsoever on your coming forward to testify today?
None whatsoever.
That was indeed the right answer, Commander. We applaud your witness. Excuse me, one other question. Is there something that you wished to share that I, in my humble non-understanding of all the technical, should have asked so that this audience and the judge should understand?
Well, I would like to explain some of the things that the airship, whether it's rigid or non-rigid, could be used for.
Exactly my point, yes.
I'm going to quote from some of my...
Isn't it a fact you showed me some of these documents before your testimony, and some of them date back so far that we had neither Xerox machine nor fax machine, but had to use carbon paper to record this.
It's true.
And yet we have survived, and we have grown, and we have learned. Please.
The airship is an extremely satisfactory vehicle for testing a great many things. Because it is stable, it has an excellent amount of electrical power, it has no vibration, and it lands quietly. Most of the equipment carried on Navy helicopters, towed sonar arrays, were all developed on airships. Practically every piece of equipment carried on a P-3B was developed on airships. It is either test vehicles or use vehicles. Things that can be used for subsequently. It could continue to be used as a flying wind tunnel. We had one we used for years, a flying wind tunnel with a 20-foot pole that came out. We could fly it with no wall effect, for those of you who are from NASA. You could, 30 years ago, they had the capability of putting a nuclear power plant on an airship and flying it successfully. That was never tried. It could be done now. You could do more infrared detection. If you had a disaster such as the fire up here, if you had an airborne hospital with the capability of a 200-bed hospital, helicopters aboard, they could immediately be taken to any disaster, and the helicopters would be there to fly patients back and forth to the hospital. It is an ideal transportation for low-density, high-volume items. It could also be used as a mothership for launching droned miniature hunter-killer subs. It could be used for an airborne emergency command post. It can be used as an airborne hunter-killer mothership, taking helicopters to the spot. It can also be used as a SOSUS transportation vehicle for the mobiles. For those of you who do not know, SOSUS is a sound surveillance system the Navy has all over the world to detect transiting submarines. This could be used to take these sound surveillance systems anywhere and monitor them so they could not be located. There are many other things. I will not bore you with them at this time.
Any witness?
Just a couple of questions, Commander. These well-worn pages of carbon paper, I take it, were made known to the political figures who made the decision to discontinue airship use as a weapon system, were they not?
They were sent in.
And I take it there was a good deal of controversy and debate even within the Navy as to the future of airships.
There was until the heavier-than-air pilots that were in existence at the time of Admiral Moffett retired, at which time the climate has improved considerably.
And ultimately, the decisions were made on economic grounds, were they not? The Defense Department simply deciding whether it was worth the cost to develop these systems.
Well, Mr. McNamara was a cost analysis gentleman.
And among the other uses...
If I may continue, he did emasculate the military to the point where it was dangerous, personally.
And among the other possible uses for lighter-than-air airships, you neglected to mention advertising film above football stadiums. Would you like to add that to your list?
It is a beautiful sight.
Thank you. Nothing further.
Okay, thank you very much. You may step down, sir. Thank you very much. All the evidence is in. Will there be any brief argument, or is the matter submitted without argument?
We would like to argue.
Sure.
You may be seated.
Yeah, I'm not sure whether his can be brief, but... I suppose my most comfortable feeling right now is that here in the 1990s, a gentleman still flies commercial aircraft. God forbid this was 1903, and the second Wright brothers plane did crash. We would not be here today, because that mentality would tell us, stop, it's too dangerous, you cannot do that. It seems that the word that was given to this system caused its own downfall. Oh, but if we had asked for the dirigible, not the rigid dirigible, because the minds became rigid. The minds could not expand as our Western philosophy, as our California pioneer spirit, and we would shut it off. Why is it that we find something that can be useful and helpful, and we're afraid because something went wrong? And yet most of the testimony here is that on the very ships of which they speak, the percentile of injury or damage is all but nil. Perhaps dramatic, but all but nil. Add up the flights that Dr. Glazer talked about, 144 flights, nothing. 2 million air miles, nothing. Why must we take this as our target? Even the good witness for the position that we ought to stand still wasn't so sure when I injected the helicopter. That wasn't done as a trick. That was because when we have something that works, it isn't perfect. But we learn from it, and we improve. Where were we in the 1950s when the President of the United States said we will go on a space mission, and hence created a job for Dr. J. Henry Glazer? Where were we at that time? We were scared that if something went wrong or they got there first, we would be wiped out. Well, I don't think it's really important who gets there first, but if it's something that can benefit society, why do we have to turn and put on blinders? The answer is because Professor Uelmen and his ilk would have it that way. I'm not going to use labels here of conservatives and liberals and different things the politicians do. I will address the court with what the evidence has been. The evidence has been overwhelming that what we have available to us, if we will, is a ship that is quiet, that is relatively safe, that gives an aura of luxury, but also has functions that need to be performed, but aren't being performed by the airship because of the politics. He's right, surveillance last weekend, but no. Let's blame the spread of the fire on the fact that we didn't have the right water, we didn't fight it as a forest fire instead of an urban fire. We're finding all the excuses, and yet when we point out to ourselves that we have techniques available to minimize, I'm not saying prevent, but to minimize the effect of certain disasters, where are we? We are disaster prone. We ignore the history, we ignore the development of technology, and we ignore the opportunity that the lighter than air would offer us if we would only maintain that spirit of what was to be America. What is at stake here is something more than the romance and the ship that J. Henry Glazer dreams of being on. What is really at stake is our own philosophy of America. If you wish to adopt their philosophy, then please prepare to stand still. Watch countries like Japan overcome us. Watch the Germany that we had destroyed overcome us. We have that opportunity now. All we need to do is to second the motion of Dean Uelmen that something that may not have worked each time then cannot be explored and used today. You're deciding something more important than just the expansion of the airship. You're deciding the direction our country should take.
Thank you, sir.
Literally from the beginning, the promoters of lighter-than-air aircraft. I wasn't alive then. I doubt I'd be on it today because I'm not a millionaire.
You'd be on it today because you won't let them fly.
Well, I think what we're promoting here with what Mr. Winston refers to as the aura of luxury is a romantic vision that is simply unrealistic, and the unrealism of it has been proved by the tragedy that unfolded. The amazing thing is not that the tragedy of the Hindenburg ended passenger flight on lighter-than aircraft, but that it took 9 tragedies to reach that point. And I think what that tells us is the holding power of romance. And I conceded that to Mr. Winston at the outset, that he does have romance on his side. But if you look at the advances in heavier than aircraft technology during the same period, going from the Shenandoah, the ZR-1, all the way up to the Hindenburg, in that same 17-year period, we went from the biplanes of World War I to the DC-3, to the B-17, to the large aircraft carriers. And the reason they won was simply economics. They delivered more bang for the buck. And that is simply a battle that the lighter-than aircraft could never win. The Zeppelins were limited by one insurmountable fact, and that fact is that it takes 45 cubic feet of helium to lift 1 pound. That fact is as true today as it was in 1937 or in 1920. And all of our romantic visions cannot change that fact. So the only way that lighter-than aircraft could go was to get bigger, and the bigger they got, the harder they were to control, especially in unpredictable weather. So I think we have established beyond a reasonable doubt today that the future of dirigible airships is limited. It is limited to advertising film and soft drinks, floating above football stadiums, giving us a bird's eye view. But as a means of passenger travel, as a military weapons system, its time has come and gone. We may mourn its passing, but we can never bring it back. Thank you.
Folks, if you just give us a couple minutes, we will confer and give you our decision. Has conferred and has made its decision. The majority decision will be announced first.
All right. I had an opportunity to listen to the evidence today, and I want to thank both sides for being so informative. I thought I knew a little bit about dirigibles and that type of travel. What I've learned here today is just absolutely overwhelming, and I do want to thank both the sides for the amount of research that they've done in making a presentation. I'm going to, well, before I tell you how I'm going to vote, I would like to comment on the evidence. First witness we heard was Dr. Glazer, who I enjoyed his presentation inasmuch as he was able to narrow down what the issue is today. When we say an idea whose time has come, it was difficult for me at first to really figure out what were we talking about. And what Dr. Glazer did is he limited it. He did indicate that what we're talking about is not the displacement of commercial travel as we know it today through the airways with airplanes, but rather it would be in somewhat of a limited type of travel, which I disagree with Professor Uelmen indicating that it would be travel for the luxurious and the rich. One must remember that at one time, even people that traveled on the Titanic were wealthy people, whether they were Vanderbilts, Rockefellers, or whatever, and people that traveled on airplanes initially were very wealthy people. But I have to look at people today. The average person can take a cruise down to the Caribbean on a ship, or they can travel from here to Los Angeles for as low as $40, $50 one way. In listening to the testimony of Richard Deal, who I feel very honored to be here with someone that actually served in a dirigible, and because I first came across dirigibles when I did a court and historical review on the court-martial of Billy Mitchell. And at that time, a tremendous amount of information was presented concerning the Shenandoah. And in that particular case, as you mentioned in the Akron, it was the Navy Department that had asked these dirigibles to go afloat so that they could do some sort of a publicity tour around the country, because at that time was a tremendous amount of fighting within Congress on getting an appropriation for either which they called the Department of War at that time, and the Navy Department. And what you testified to today was the fact that it was human error, that it was a instrument error, the altimeter not working properly. And I truly believe that after 30 or 40 years that have gone by, that we do have technological advances, both in meteorological satellites, new fabrics, new alloys, which I think that although they may not cut the price of constructing such an airship, nevertheless, I think that there is possibilities in very limited travel. That particular travel would be where people would use it more maybe on a recreational basis rather than, say, a commercial enterprise, and to keep it away from places such as the Middle West that does have some very turbulent winds and tornadoes, and crossing the Atlantic, or the Pacific, which can be a very dangerous venture. And in listening to Commander Moore, I guess perhaps I am optimistic and I am a romanticist, and I think I'd like to stimulate your interest again in dirigibles, so I am going to vote for dirigible airships. I think an idea has come.
Okay. And the minority position?
Mr. Winston, I found your position compelling. However, what you're proposing is an alternative form of travel ostensibly to promote grace and romance. And I believe grace is something that is learned and not bought. And I believe romance should be sought at lower altitude. So I have to rule in favor of Dino.
Thank you, folks, for coming today. Thanks for the very excellent presentation. We all appreciate it. Thank you so much. And we'll take the tour now.